Excellent. Good morning, everyone. I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Richard Vivers, and I'm the founder of an organisation called the Ocean Agency. And we've been working with NOAA for the last couple of years, really focusing on the coral bleaching event that's been happening around the world. And that's what this talk is going to be about. But before I kick off, I'm going to just play a 360 video on a science on a sphere, which is, I think, the first time anyone's ever done this. So we'll see how this one goes. This is to show you what a reef should look like. So this is a 360 video of Lady Elliot Island on the Great Barrier Reef, on the far south end of the Great Barrier Reef. And it's just quite incredible, the biodiversity. We were fortunate enough to have a dolphin turn up for our dive, which was the first ever 360 video that we took. But what a lot of people don't realise is this biodiversity relies on the coral structure. So it's the nursery of the ocean, and it's really critical for getting this number of fish around. So what we're going to do now is talk about some of the bleaching, and it really kicked off for me in Hawaii. So this is 2 years ago, and that's on this island actually. Basically we came over here just after we heard the third global bleaching event was really starting to kick off. We didn't know it was going to be a global bleaching event at that stage, but we heard about the bleaching in Hawaii. So off we went to Lanikai Beach, and I jumped in the water there, and we saw some of these really old corals turning bright white. Now the visibility wasn't great that day, but it really affected me, to be honest, seeing bleaching on this scale so early on. Then we decided what we were going to do is track this around the world as it progressed. So off we went, and we knew there was a reef in American Samoa called Airport Reef, and this reef was famous for bleaching. So we thought this would be a perfect place to go in and get some images before the bleaching hits, and then images after the bleaching or during the bleaching to show this transformation. And what you can see here is a very, very healthy reef. So all this staghorn, you can see it's got that healthy brown colour, which is the healthy colour of the flesh of the corals. But what happened was then the bleaching event struck American Samoa, and this was it when we went in at the height of the bleaching. Now what you're seeing here is the flesh of the animals, the corals, has turned clear, and you're seeing their skeletons. And this is the starvation process that corals go through. Now sometimes they can recover from this if the conditions improve, and sometimes they die. But fortunately Airport Reef is one of those reefs that is prone to bleaching, and these corals are very resilient to bleaching, and they've always bounced back in the past. So when I went back there 4 months later to see what had happened to this reef, I was expecting to see a lot of these corals to bounce back. What I saw was this. That reef was almost entirely dead. You can see all the structures starting to fall apart, and it's covered with algae. And it's going to take a very long time for this reef to bounce back. And it requires us not to have further bleaching events, and for us to have the right populations of fish to be able to remove the algae, etc., for that reef to recover. Now what we've been finding over the last 2 years is this bleaching event has been tracking around the world, and so we've been going in to really reveal this as much as possible through global media. Now for me this is almost the quintessential bleaching shot. It's this white reef. This was in the Maldives. So we responded, we flew in we only had 2 days in the Maldives to get these images. But as you can see, all the different species really are really heavily bleached. And it was one of the most spectacular sights I've seen. And that's the interesting thing about bleaching. It is the most beautiful death, which allows you to get media attention around it. And that's the story we've been trying to tell. But nothing prepared me for when we went to New Caledonia, and this is imagery that we haven't released yet, but I thought I'd give you a sneak preview. We went off to New Caledonia because we heard about bleaching there. And I saw some images which gave me an indication that there was some really severe fluorescing. I jumped in the water and it was probably the most beautiful sight I've seen underwater, even though this reef was dying. You see these vivid colours, especially the yellows, as I'll spin it around for you. These yellows and blues are part of the bleaching process. Now, I've never seen any imagery like this showing it fluorescing this vividly. These are actually, it's a chemical within the tissue of the animal that is like a sunscreen. So again, the skeleton, well, the coral has lost its colour and it's revealing its sunscreen chemical, which then is glowing because of the white skeleton underneath. So these colours don't even do it justice. It is like everything's been painted with a highlighter colour. The blue colour, which doesn't come across in these images anywhere close to being as vivid as what we saw, is there's a colour like, it's called Eve Klein blue, which is one of the brightest blues you'll ever see. It's the colour of your shirt, and it glows, and that's what we were seeing underwater. And it is really quite a stunning sight. But unfortunately, if you go back to these locations, often you find the next stage. And when we went to the Great Barrier Reef, this was one of the saddest sights that I've seen. This was one of my favourite areas. It was one of the most pristine areas on the reef, at the far north of the Great Barrier Reef. And this year, it got heavily hit. We lost 22% of the corals on the Great Barrier Reef this year. And what you're seeing is, here, we jumped in the water, and the corals, which were so vivid a few months before, and so healthy a few months before, looked like they'd been dead for years. But in amongst them was these soft corals, which were rotting. And you could see them dripping off the structure. And it was only really when I got out of the water that you realise the true impact of these bleaching events. I actually stank of rotting animals. And it was one of the most horrific dive experiences I've ever had. And it makes you realise this is animals dying at scale. It's not rocks, it's not a bizarre animal that's sort of half plant, half animals. It's animals that are dying en masse. And that's why it's so important to communicate this story of coral bleaching, because it's predicted to be becoming more and more frequent as the temperature rises. Now, we work with NOAA on naming this event as the third global bleaching event, drawing a line in the sand so that we could express to the media just, well, the fact that this is a new climate change phenomenon. It only really started right at the early 80s, and we've had 2 impacts before now, and this is the third global event. And we're expecting many more to come. So really it's critical how we protect these marine environments now to ensure they are protected against what is coming in the near future. And at this point, I will just hand over to Paolo.
Thank you, Richard, for that very striking presentation. Now we're going to hear a little bit more about the data behind this death event that we're seeing here. As Richard mentioned, what we're seeing is not usual. This is extraordinary. We at NOAA have been monitoring this situation from far above, from satellites. And I want to walk you through the data products that we have that is giving managers worldwide an advanced view of what's happening now, in the next week, and in the next few months for them to prepare and try to respond to this event. What we're looking at here is sea surface temperatures around the world. This is information relayed through satellites that are orbiting the Earth, or orbiting satellites that are taking the temperature at night, the first few millimeters of the sea surface. But that's a good indication of what temperature we have, the coral reef are experiencing the first few meters under the sea surface. And you can see that most of it it's going to the 80 and 90 degree change. That is very, very hot. And what we're looking at is basically every day we're getting this information relayed back to us. Now, sea surface temperature alone doesn't tell us the whole story, because animals have evolved to withstand the temperatures around them that had basically became a baseline over a long time. So just knowing the absolute temperature doesn't tell us what we need to know. What we really need to know is how different the temperatures today are from what that long-term average, and it's what we call an anomaly. How much hotter or colder it is today versus that long-term average that we have beginning in 1985 to 2012. 28 years of data compared to what we have now. So what you're looking at here, the reds indicate 4 to 5 degrees centigrade hotter than that long-term average. That is tremendous amount of heat, excess heat that is going into the ocean. Again, that is not normal. But we want to pay attention to this because the organisms have adapted to that long-term average. So what happens? Well, let's take a look at coral reefs themselves. Here's the globe indicating the shallow areas. As probably many of you know, coral reefs are between the tropics. And they're located in basically most of the tropical waters around the world. And they're incredibly resilient ecosystems. They love that warm temperature. They have adapted to live on that. But the moment it gets a little bit hotter above to what they're used to, trouble begins. Now, when we talk about a coral reef, we're not just talking about a single animal. We're talking about an entire ecosystem. We have invertebrates, algae, fish. All sorts of animals make up this unique ecosystem. In fact, it's one of the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. You have less than a quarter of marine life, of space, a quarter of fraction, but a quarter of all marine life are in this coral reef ecosystem. The star, however, are the corals and the coral polyps. Each one alone, the size of a grain of rice, but collectively, they can be seen from space. These organisms, however, are beginning to feel the effect, are basically having fever. And how do we tell that information? How can we capture that through satellites? Well, we created a product called the coral bleaching hotspot that is telling us every time the temperature goes above that maximum summer temperature over the long-term average. It's a local value. A coral in the Red Sea is used to much hotter waters than a coral in Hawaii. So it's very much a localized value. But anytime it goes over that 28-year average, we call it a hotspot. Basically, start paying attention because the water here begins, it's getting a little bit hotter. The next product that we developed to start telling that story is what we call the degree heating weeks. The best analogy I can give you is that if you're going to bake a lasagna and you have it ready to go in the oven, you need two pieces of information. What do you need? You have the lasagna, you're going to put it in the oven. What do you need? What information you need? Temperature and time. Basically, you need to know how much thermal energy you need to put into that raw lasagna so you can eat it later. It's the same concept behind here, degree heating weeks. It's measuring how much thermal energy is being added to the corals. And what it does is basically how hot it got over how long. And we're measuring that against that long-term average. Now corals, you can see from 0 to 1 degree centigrade, corals can take that. They can take a little bit of heat. So we have that in blue. But research has shown that the moment it gets above that 1 degree mark, corals start experiencing what we call thermal stress. So that's where we have the degree heating weeks. So to give you an example, a degree heating week of 2 here would indicate that it has been 2 degrees above normal for 2 weeks, for 1 week, or 1 degree above normal for 2 weeks. That will give you the same amount, degree heating weeks, because it's the same amount of extra thermal energy that has gone into the corals. Now, corals respond to this in a sadly predictable manner. What we have here is when the degree heating week, when that temperature is under 1 degree, that over the long-term average, no stress. Anytime it gets above the long-term average, we say it's a watch. Basically, pay attention. It's hotter than usual. Whenever it gets above that magical 1 degree mark, that corals can do okay under it, we call it a warning. Pay attention to that area. Whenever the degree heating weeks get to 4, we get alert level 1. Again, 4 to 8 degree heating weeks. To get a 4 degree heating week mark, it can be 4 weeks at 1 degree above, or 2 weeks at 2 degrees above. We can expect to see more coral bleaching happening when you have alert level 1. When it passes 8 weeks, that's alert level 2. That's when we know that there's going to be mortality in the coral reef. So if you get in the water and it's under alert level 2, we can see that the corals are going to, you can expect some mortality. What we're looking at here is basically over the next 7 days, what we can expect over there. Again, when we're looking at the reds, that's very unusual. We can either expect mortality or bleaching or mortality. The last product we developed is looking at that long-term, what we call the 4-month outlook, that long-term view out the window at the 60% probability. So, looking at here, the reefs in Indonesia, we can expect to see alert level 1 and alert level 2 before the end of the year. Meaning we're expecting to see mortality in the Coral Triangle region. Sadly, this is something that has continued for the last 3 years. As Richard mentioned, this is the 3rd global bleaching event. 95% of all reefs in the world have experienced thermal stress worldwide in the last 3 years. In Hawaii, half of the reefs in West Hawaii died in the last bleaching season alone. Imagine the forest is on fire. That lasagna that you put in the oven a while ago is burning. So this is not business as usual. It's not an annual occurrence that is normal for it to happen. This is a 3rd extinction event that we're seeing now, where we're in the Great Barrier Reef, entire tracts of reef disappear over that. As Richard vividly mentioned, the smelling of death when you come out of water from filming the coral reefs. Now, what can we do? We all want to have reefs that look like this before the bleaching. Well, whenever we have an advance notice that there's going to be a bleaching event happening, we send out a notice to the managers. The managers can get their team ready to start monitoring. And this is a question that came up on the Facebook feed. So we can send people in the water, because as good as satellites are to give us a global view of what's happening, it's not enough, because the temperatures really close to the coastline cannot be properly modeled. So we send teams in the water, we have buoys, and we start getting very, very localized data. And then we start monitoring, and then we see what happens. It's hard to mount a management response if you cannot monitor what's happening. Also what we do, we start going back to the same reefs, and we start studying the mortality that you see from the reefs as they're bleaching. In some ways, some areas have closed off the entire reef altogether to tourism. Phuket, Thailand did that a couple of years ago. There's not many things you can do at a large scale when your reef is bleaching. But there's something that you can do before that to build the resiliency of the reef. Because we know that basically bleaching is a response to stress. The corals are stressed and they expel the zooxanthellae. If you build the overall resiliency, corals may be able to withstand bleaching a little bit better or bounce back. So I'll give you an example. When corals are bleached, many times algae, invasive algae or regular algae, might try to use that opportunity to invade the area. If there's no fish around, there will be nothing stopping the algae from overtaking the coral reefs. And it's really an unfair competition, because at most coral reefs can only grow a fraction of a centimeter a year, whereas algae can do that in a month or weeks, depending on the species. But if you have fish, herbivorous fish, that are able to keep that algae in check, then you're giving reefs a chance. Also, controlling sediments. Whenever you have a large river loading a lot of sediments into a coral reef area, it's limiting how much light the corals can get, and basically begin that starvation process, the same one that begins when the corals bleach. So by stopping that sedimentation from getting to the water, you're making the reefs a little bit healthier. It's like when you're getting sick. If you get the flu, if you've been healthy for the last year, it's not going to affect you a whole lot. But if you just were sick a month ago, that's going to hit you really hard. So the same thing with corals. If they have been relatively healthy for the last few months, they can bounce back, higher chances of bouncing back. But however, when we have a coral bleaching alert level 2, when we expect mortality, there's really not a lot that corals can do on that. If they've been bleached and the bleaching stays for 2-3 months, those corals are going to die, and then you begin the process of trying to build up the reef from scratch. So it's better to avoid getting to that spot. We have a few minutes for Q&A, so any questions for Richard or I? The data is what we have here. Data on the Indian Ocean is global. And actually, if you go to Coral Reef Watch, you can sign up for an alert to be delivered to the reef that is most closest to you via email, and you get alerted, what we call a virtual station. So you get alerted. Your corals are under watch, and then it will give you some chance to mount a response. Examples of reef bleaching and coming back. We do have examples of corals that have bleached and have come back. In the last bleaching event that I mentioned, where we lost half of the coral reefs in West Hawaii, the ones in Kaneohe, in this island, bleached but came back. And the ones in Hanauma Bay, another area here, bleached and came back. It happens that those two are areas where we have an active management response in the wave. In Kaneohe Bay, what we have a problem with invasive algae, and we've deployed a barge with a tool called the Super Soaker, which is basically an underwater vacuum that is soaking up all the algae. So we're keeping invasive algae off, and then what we're doing, we're deploying native sea urchins, from 50 to 100,000 sea urchins in this reef over the area. So those reefs have done a lot better, and this is being done by State of Hawaii, DLNR Division of Aquatic Resources. So we've taken preventive measurements, and those reefs have done better. Richard, any examples of reefs coming back? From what you've seen?
Yeah, I think it's about 40% of the reefs that we've seen have bounced back, and it's often surprising which ones do bounce back and which ones don't bounce back. We don't have the resources to go in every time, but the feedback is often quite surprising. So it is about the resilience of the reef in the first place to see how it bounced back. Now, early indications from New Caledonia, which was that really spectacular bleaching with the fluorescing corals, is the resilience of those reefs was actually extremely high. They were very, very healthy, very well protected in the first place, and they don't seem to have had the mortality that I would have expected from that imagery, especially in that exact location. A lot of those corals survived, which was surprising. So it's all about hoping for the best and preparing for the best to allow that to actually happen. If that bleaching goes on for too long, it will die. But then it's a case of how quickly can it bounce back. And if you've got other reefs reseeding and you have got those fish populations, then they can bounce back quite quickly. My understanding, and I'm fairly new to all of this, so I've been learning about this over the last 2 years, is it's a combination of both. So it's about exposure to direct sunlight, which is a stressor, and it's the temperature of the water, which is also a stressor, added onto the other stressors. So if there's pollution, etc., that's another impact that can impact the bleaching. The deeper reefs are less likely to bleach in many instances, but we've seen some very deep bleaching happening around the world. It all depends on some of those sort of deep water currents. So if that temperature rise is significant at those deeper depths, they're going to bleach in the same way as the shallow. We also had a question, which is for you, which is about the bleaching in Hawaii. and when we're likely to see the peak here.
So let's see what the data. So on the question of what we can expect here in Hawaii, right now it has subsided a little bit, but we're entering that period when we're looking at the 4-month outlook between now and the end of the year. We are seeing that many of the reefs here in Hawaii would be at least, there's a 60% probability of hitting alert level 1 or 2. So better than 50-50 chance that we're going to see bleaching and some mortality coming up before the end of the year. And on the question of basically how sunlight affects temperature, in some areas, they've been able, corals that where the temperature has hit bleaching threshold, they've been able to put underwater sort of shading over those reefs, and they're able to avoid some of the responses to bleaching. But obviously, it is a very localized action. You couldn't do that over long term, but it's, UV radiation does play a role after a certain temperature threshold has been met. Any other questions? What is this? The purple. I believe the purple is coral reef locations. So that's the layer that we added to this map where coral reef are located. It's a little bit easier to see when you have certain colors against it. But you see, like here in the Galapagos, there are coral reefs. So it's a layer that we added to this earth layer to show you the coral reef locations. Long-term forecasts and projections. So that's stepping up into basically climate change models. So from the Coral Reef Watch, the farthest we go there with the products is 4 months. Then we start looking into climate change predictions. And we do have we've been doing downscaling climate change modeling. So you have climate change over the entire global region, and then there are people that are downscaling what's going to be the impact to Hawaii. And the picture from that is very sobering. Basically, before the middle of the century, we can expect bleaching here in Hawaii to occur on a frequent basis, maybe every 2 to 3 years. There's some, like 10 years of difference between some reefs here in Hawaii and the upper ones that are a little bit colder, but eventually all of them are going to be bleaching. There's a question of how will reefs adapt to that? They have a few decades to adapt. And we don't know. It's an open question, and there's a lot of research going on trying to anticipate, will corals be able to modify that symbiotic relationship that they have with the zooxanthellae to adapt? In some cases, there's the case that when corals bleach, a different type of zooxanthellae comes back. In some cases, can be a little bit more thermal tolerant, but it can be at the expense of something else. And we don't know that, and it's very actively researched. And some people are working on what they call assisted evolution of these of coral reefs. It's hard to know what will be promising in a couple of decades from now. Okay, we are out of time. You're welcome to hang around here with us, but we will have to take out the microphone because there's another presentation coming up. Thank you.